Summer in the Virginia suburbs always carries an unusual sense of peace. In a house nestled beneath sprawling oak trees, I stood in front of the bedroom mirror, fumbling with the straps of my sundress. The late afternoon sun streamed through the blinds, casting golden streaks across the hardwood floor. But my mind wasn't there, it was somewhere else, drifting between memories and the present. Dinner was ready. I had just finished setting the table, placing the silverware neatly in its place. I was waiting for Ben, my late husband's stepson, to come inside from the backyard. He was out there fixing the broken trellis, a task he had taken on willingly without me even asking. A light breeze passed through the open window, causing the strap of my dress to slip off my shoulder as I awkwardly adjusted it. I caught myself smiling at 52 small moments like this, had a way of reminding me of the long, winding road I'd walked in life, full of changes I'd never expected. It's been nearly 5 years since. Jason, my husband, passed away. He left me with everything: a spacious house, financial security, and memories many would envy, but that tranquility came with an ache, a loneliness I hadn't anticipated. Every room in this house still echoed with Jason's laughter, but now it's just me, staring at walls that feel too cold, too quiet. And then there's Ben at 27. He's Jason's son from his first marriage, with his tall frame, deep-set eyes, and that half-smile of his equal parts mysterious and sincere. Ben has a presence that's hard to ignore since Jason's passing. He's been my rock, making sure I never felt alone. "Family doesn't end just because someone's gone," he said at Jason's funeral, his hand warm and firm in mine. It was a moment I've never forgotten. Over time, Ben has become indispensable in my life. He fixes leaky roofs, tends the garden, and sometimes simply sits with me on the porch, sipping iced tea, as the sun sets over the distant fields. But recently, something shifted. Something I can't quite name. Maybe it's the way his gaze lingers a little too long when he hands me a tool, or the way the space between us feels smaller whenever he stands close. Maybe it's both. I've tried to brush off these thoughts, convincing myself they're just the natural reactions of a woman who hasn't felt someone's attention in far too long. But the more I deny it, the more I realize this is and my imagination. And today, as I stood before the mirror, adjusting my dress, it hit me. This house isn't just a place where I live alone anymore. It's becoming the start of something else, something I'm not sure I'm ready to face. What do you think about these first feelings? If you're curious to know where the story goes, or comment the number 5 to let me know. Can you guess how things might unfold? Don't forget to share your thoughts, Part 2. The first spark of emotion. The evening light began to fade over the backyard, and the steady sound of a hammer hitting wood echoed. Through the air, I stood in the kitchen, my gaze unintentionally drifting toward the window, where Ben was intently repairing the broken trellis. His tall frame stood out against the lush green of the garden, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead under the golden glow of the setting sun. I took a deep breath, telling myself that whatever I was feeling was simply a product of loneliness, nothing more, nothing less. I returned to the bedroom, adjusting my sundress before heading downstairs to call Ben in for dinner. But as I struggled with the thin strap on my shoulder, it slipped again. My fingers fumbled with a clasp clumsier than usual. Then suddenly, the other strap came undone and the dress slid down to my hips. I stood, frozen in front of the mirror, sunlight casting a warm glow on my bare skin. A wave of surprise and embarrassment washed over me. I reached to pull the dress back up, but just as I did, there was a soft knock at the doorframe. "Smells amazing in here, ma'am." Ben's deep, slightly hesitant voice broke the silence. Startled, I turned quickly, clutching the dress to my chest. Ben was standing at the doorway, his gaze lingering for just a fraction of a second before he quickly looked away. "I'm so sorry, I didn't realize the door wasn't closed," he stammered, his voice filled with nervousness. "It's fine," I interrupted, trying to sound calm despite the heat rushing to my cheeks. I could feel them flush as I tried to compose myself. Ben nodded hurriedly, stepping back as though the air between us had suddenly become too charged. His eyes flickered toward me one last time before he turned and walked briskly down the hallway. I stood there, one hand gripping the dress tightly and the other resting on the edge of the dresser for support. My heart pounded, not just from embarrassment, but from a strange, unnameable feeling stirring inside me. How long had it been since I'd seen an expression like that one, of surprise mixed with something else? Couldn't quite define. I looked at my reflection in the mirror, feeling the undeniable flutter in my chest, instead of trying to make sense of it. I buried the feeling, convincing myself it was nothing more than an awkward accident. Later that evening, Ben sat at the head of the dining table, his shirt sleeves rolled up, revealing his tanned forearms. "The roast chicken is amazing tonight," he said, glancing up at me briefly before returning to his plate. I smiled in response. My mind was spinning with the memory of the earlier moment, the way his eyes had widened, his voice had faltered, and the way he'd seemed unsure of what to do. I couldn't stop wondering. Had he seen more than he should have? And if he had, what was he thinking? The air between us felt different, not tense exactly, but no longer as effortlessly easy as before. I tried to focus on the meal, on the small talk about his work and daily routines, but each time our eyes met, there was an unspoken weight that hung between us. And I realized, much to my discomfort, that I was feeling it too after dinner. Ben offered to wash the dishes. I sat in the living room listening to the sound of running water and the clink of plates, trying to quiet the chaos in my mind. From where I sat, I could see him at the sink, his broad shoulders moving rhythmically under his t-shirt as he leaned over the counter. In that moment, everything became painfully clear. I wasn't just looking at Ben as a stepson or even as a friend. I was seeing him in a way I'd never allowed myself to before. When Ben finished the dishes and turned to look at me, our eyes locked in a gaze that lingered just a little too long. I quickly looked away, but my heart refused to slow its erratic pace. Maybe I'd been wrong to think I was too old to feel this way again, but regardless, I couldn't deny that something had awakened. Something I didn't yet know how to face. Part 3, Subtle Developments, the next morning. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen window as I poured my first cup of coffee for the day. The soft creak of the back door caught my attention, and I turned to see Ben stepping inside, toolbox in hand. His hair was slightly T-Z, as if he hadn't been awake for long. His white t-shirt clung to his broad frame, and I realized my gaze lingered longer than it should have. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice low and slightly hoarse. "Still carrying traces of sleep, morning," I replied, doing my best to sound composed. "What's on the agenda today?" "I thought I'd fix the back fence before it gets too hot," he said, stepping closer, his eyes glinting with the freshness of the early morning. I lifted the coffee pot, smiling softly. "Coffee black? Sure, thanks," he said, flashing his familiar half-smile, the one that never failed to make my heart beat just a little faster when I handed him the mug. Our fingers brushed. For a brief moment, it was a small gesture, but it sent an unexpected ripple through me, leaving me momentarily breathless. That entire day, I found myself watching Ben from the porch, pretending to read a book. But unable to focus on a single page, he worked diligently under the sun, repairing the old wooden fence with a patience and focus that was mesmerizing. Beads of sweat glistened on his forehead, the sunlight casting a golden glow on his tanned skin. Every movement exuded a quiet confidence that made it impossible to look away when Ben glanced in my direction. I quickly averted my gaze, pretending to adjust the hem of my dress, but I knew he'd seen me. Watching, a mix of embarrassment and anticipation stirred within me, making it impossible to sit still that afternoon. I brought out a tray of Sea-Hold lemonade to cool him off. He sat on the porch steps, let his t-shirt damp with sweat, his hair sticking to his forehead. I handed him a glass, and as he took it, our eyes met again. This time, though, Ben didn't look away. His gaze lingered, steady and searching. "You've seemed happier lately," he said, breaking the silence. "Is it the weather, or is it because I've been coming around more?" I laughed softly, though the sound couldn't mask my nervousness. "You've been a big help. I really appreciate it." I like being here, he said. A hi. His tone light, but sincere. It feels like home. His words made me pause. A warmth blooming in my chest, tempered by a flicker of unease. I didn't know how to respond because, deep down, part of me didn't want him to leave either. I smiled, looking down at my glass to avoid meeting his eyes. In the days that followed, Ben started coming over more often. Each time he had a reason, a squeaky hinge, a loose floorboard, the garden needing trimming, but we both knew those tasks weren't the real reason. Occasionally, he stood closer than necessary while we flipped through old family photo albums. Sometimes I caught him looking at me longer than he should, as if trying to decipher something. I wasn't ready to admit that evening, over dinner, the air between us felt thicker than usual. Ben sat across from me, his sleeves rolled up, exposing his tanned forearms. His eyes darted to mine for a brief moment before he quickly looked away, but I couldn't ignore the subtle intensity in that glance. A tenderness, a yearning, or perhaps both. I found myself wondering, what am I doing? But the answer never came. I couldn't deny that for the first time since Jason passed, I felt alive in a way I hadn't thought possible. Ticking of the clock echoing through the large space. I cradled a mug of hot tea in my hands, trying to think of something to say to break the stillness. But no words came. Then, unexpectedly, Ben spoke. "Ma'am, I've been thinking about this for a long time," he said, his voice low and calm, though there was a tension beneath it that I couldn't ignore, thinking about what I asked, trying to keep my voice steady even though a wave of unease rippled through me. About us, his gaze locked firmly onto M. "I know this might sound wrong, but I can't stop feeling this way." My heart tightened. "Ben, what are you talking about?" He straightened in his seat, his eyes glowing with determination in the soft light. "I know we're not supposed to think about this. I've tried to ignore it, tried to push these feelings away, but every time I'm here, every time I see you, I can't lie to myself anymore." I set my tea down on the table, my hands trembling. "Ben, this isn't right. You know that. Don't you?" "I do," he admitted, his voice tinged with pain. "But sometimes, what feels right doesn't follow the rules. I can't stop thinking about you. I can't stop wanting to be here with you." I stood up and walked to the window, watching the rain pour relentlessly outside. The cold glass against my hand steadied me, grounding me in the weight of the moment. "Ben, you're young. You have your whole life ahead of you. As for me, I'm long past the point where I let myself get swept up in something like this, but you feel it too, don't you?" He stood and stepped closer. "You feel it just like I do. Don't lie to me or to yourself." I turned to face him, my heart a battleground of conflict. "Ben, this isn't easy. Do you know how hard I've tried to live the right way since Jason passed? Your family, Ben. You're part of the life Jason left behind." "I'm not Jason," he said, his voice steady and firm, "and I don't want to replace him, but I need you to know that I care about you, not out of obligation, but because of who you are." His words struck me like an arrow to the heart. I couldn't argue with him because deep down I knew he was right, but at the same time, fear and the weight of moral boundaries clung to me like chains after a long silence. Ben reached out and gently touched my hand. "Just this once, ma'am. I'm not trying to pressure you, but if you feel something, anything, I just need to know." I looked at him, his eyes filled with both sincerity and some vulnerability. I knew that crossing this line would change everything forever. I closed my eyes, feeling the warmth of his hand, and before I could stop myself, I gave a slight nod. Ben leaned down, his hands cupping my face with a tenderness I hadn't felt in years. Our first kiss was soft, tentative, as though we were both testing the waters of this uncharted territory. But soon it deepened, and the emotions we had both buried for so long finally surfaced unrestrained when we pulled away. Ben looked into my eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice. I couldn't stop myself. I shook my head, my hands lightly resting against his cheeks. Don't apologize. Ben, this isn't just your fault that night. We sat together in silence, listening to the rain. Outside, the room seemed smaller, as though the world had shrunk to just the two of us. But even in that moment, I couldn't forget that the world outside still existed, with its rules, its barriers, and its judgments, and I wasn't sure if I had the strength to face it all. Part 5, Inner Struggle. The next morning, pale sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, illuminating the stillness of the room. I sat in an old armchair in the living room, holding a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Everything in the house remained as peaceful as ever, but inside me a storm was raging. The events of the night before kept replaying in my mind on an endless loop. The kiss, Ben's gaze, and the strange yet familiar feeling of being close to him was like a film I couldn't turn off. Ben had left before sunrise, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead and promising that we'd talk again. He walked out the door, leaving me behind with a tangled mess of emotions. I didn't know what to feel: happiness, guilt, or fear. In the days that followed, I tried to return to my normal routine, gardening, tidying up the house, even repainting the living room. But no matter how busy I kept myself, I couldn't escape thoughts of Ben. Every time I stood in the kitchen, I remembered the way he looked at me as he took a cup of coffee from my hands. Every time I stepped into the garden, I pictured him bent over the fence. He'd been fixing his warm smile, and strong hands etched in my memory. I knew I shouldn't let my feelings cross a line, but how could I not when every corner of the house, every mar reminded me of him? Had I made a mistake by letting things go this far, or was this somehow the right thing in the wrong circumstances? A week later, Ben returned. I heard the sound of his truck pulling up outside, and my heart began to race. I wasn't ready to face him, but when he knocked on the door, I knew I couldn't avoid him forever. "Ma'am?" he said when I opened the door, his eyes filled with concern. "I wasn't sure if you wanted to see me, but I needed to talk to you." I invited him in, and we sat across from each other in the living room. The silence between us stretched out, but this time it wasn't just awkward. It was heavy laden with everything we hadn't said. "I've been thinking a lot about that night," Ben began, his voice steady but low. "I know this isn't easy, and I understand if you want to stop, but I can't pretend that I don't feel something. I care about you not because I think you're lonely or because I want to replace anyone. I care about you because I truly see you." His words made me feel exposed, like he was peeling away every layer I tried to use to protect myself. I didn't know what to say. "Ben, this isn't simple. You're Jason's son, and I can't ignore that boundary, but don't we have the right to choose our own lives?" Ben interrupted, his eyes pleading with me. "You've spent your whole life doing what's right. Maybe this time you should think about what makes you happy." After our conversation, I felt torn in two. One half of me wanted to turn away, to shut this door forever, and preserve everything I'd spent years protecting. But the other half, the half that longed to feel alive again, wanted to step through, to embrace the possibility of being loved once more. That evening, I stood in the kitchen preparing dinner. The smell of chicken soup filled the house, but I couldn't focus on anything when the doorbell rang. I knew it was Ben, and this time I didn't hesitate. I opened the door and saw him standing there, his expression resolute. "I can't stop," he said. "You can push me away, but I won't stop feeling this." I took a deep breath, my eyes meeting his filled with both fear and surrender. "Then don't stop," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. Ben stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and in that moment I knew there was no turning back. NSH Part 6. The turning point that evening, when Ben walked into the house, I could feel it. The air between us had changed. Forever. There was no longer any awkwardness or sidelong glances, but instead an undeniable acknowledgement. He moved closer to me, step by deliberate step, and I didn't pull away. We stood there face to face in a moment that seemed to suspend time. "Are you sure?" Ben asked, his voice low and steady, as though giving me one last chance to change my mind. I nodded, my gaze never leaving his. "I've thought about this a lot, Ben. I don't know if we're doing the right thing, but I know I can't keep lying to myself." He stepped forward, gently placing his hands on my shoulders. "We don't have to rush. Just let me be here for you, so you don't have to spend another day feeling alone." His words were like a balm for my soul. I couldn't stop the tears from falling, and Ben wrapped me in his arms. In that embrace, I found a comfort I hadn't felt in years, something I thought I'd never feel again. In the weeks that followed, Ben and I spent more time together, though we kept everything hidden from those around us. We maintained our usual routines. He came over in the afternoons to fix odds and ends around the house, and I prepared dinner, like always, but between us, there was something new. An unspoken connection that we both understood, but didn't need to put into words. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ben broke the silence. "Do you ever think about whether you deserve to be happy? Not the kind of happiness people expect you to have, but the kind you really want." His question caught me off guard. I watched the last rays of sunlight disappear behind the trees, feeling as though his words weren't just for the woman I was now, but for all the years I'd let slip away. "I don't know," I said softly. "Maybe I've forgotten what that feels like." "Then let me remind you," Ben said, a faint smile on his lips, though his eyes held a seriousness that made my chest tighten. "You don't have to live for the past or for the people who are gone. You deserve to live for yourself." But not everything went smoothly. One afternoon, while I was watering the garden, our neighbor Mrs. Martha stopped by. She noticed Ben repairing the back door and smiled knowingly. "Ben is such a wonderful stepson," she said, her eyes flicking toward me. "He always looking after you so well." I returned her smile, but unease crept into my chest. Comments and glances like that could easily be innocent, or they could be signs of suspicion. I wondered what would happen if people found out about us. How would I face the judgment in their eyes? And worse, would Jason's memory be overshadowed by my choices that evening? As Ben was leaving, I stopped him at the door. "Ben, have you ever thought about what the consequences of this might be?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "If people ever find out, we'll be judged for this, for us, not just me, but you too." He stepped closer, his gaze unwavering as he looked into my eyes. "I have thought about it, and I don't care what anyone thinks, ma'am. All I care about is how we feel. What about you? Are you really worried about them, or are you worried because you're not sure about yourself?" His words left me speechless. Yes, a part of me was afraid of others, but more than that, I was afraid of myself. Afraid that if I crossed this line, there would be no going back, no way to undo it. If things fell apart, but then I realized that not crossing it would be just as bad. It would mean living in the shadow of loneliness forever. "You're right," I said, my voice steadier than it had been in a long time. "I can't keep living in fear. I deserve to be happy." Ben smiled, his eyes filled with quiet confidence. "I promise you won't regret this. This story is no longer just about an inner struggle. It's about the journey of breaking free from the walls we build for ourselves." Together, Ben and I chose to live honestly with our feelings, no matter the judgment or uncertainty that lay ahead. If you'd like to hear what happens next, comment part 2